Okay, right. So psychology is really popular at OLA. I think this year we've got a class size of 12 in the lower sixth. The upper sixth who just finished, it's quite a small year group, so we only had 6, but the projected numbers for September is 15, which is quite large for psychology, really popular. And it attracts people from all areas, really. So people doing sciences like to do psychology, but also we have lots of people who are more English-based or art-based. Most years we usually have 1 or 2 people who also apply to do psychology at university. So this year, out of my 6 that chose psychology for the upper sixth, there's 3 of them going on to university to study psychology, which is fantastic. So during the lower sixth year, if you choose to study psychology, there's a number of different topics that we look into. And it's like an introduction to psychology, so it covers all sorts of areas. One of the topics is approaches to psychology, or approaches in psychology, where we look at how different angles or different approaches investigate human behaviour. So, for example, the learning approaches tend to assume that we don't have any prior knowledge, we don't have any inherited ability or behaviours, and that everything that we learn is from day one, we just learn it from our environment and the experiences that we have. Whereas the biological approach is much more based on what we inherit, hormones and neurotransmitters in our system, in our bodies, which affect our behaviour. And our biological structure in terms of our perhaps brain structure. And so we might look at different behaviours from a biological point of view. And then we also do in approaches, we also do some Freudian psychology. So we look at the psychodynamic approach, and we also look at the humanistic approach. So it covers a range of sort of areas. We also cover what's called research methods, which is how psychologists collect data and carry out studies on people. So we might look at how to carry out an observation or an interview or an experiment. And within that, there's some statistical analysis as well. So this is something to be aware of, because some pupils turn up and then say, oh, you didn't warn me there was maths in psychology. About 10% of the overall exam is maths based. So there's some of it's really straightforward, things like working out a mean or interpreting a graph, but some of it is a bit more complicated, like having to interpret the results of a statistical test to see whether or not findings are significant. So it can get a bit complicated, but if pupils have got at least a 5 in their maths, they will be absolutely fine. We look at a range of disorders in psychology. So the ones we do in the lower sixth year are phobias, depression, and obsessive compulsive disorder. So it's really important before signing up that you're aware that we do cover some of these mental health issues. So if there are pupils who are anxious about any of these, it doesn't mean don't do it. It's obviously really interesting areas, but just to be aware that we do spend a term looking at these disorders. So it's really interesting, but occasionally we get pupils who find those a little bit concerning, maybe. And then there's a topic which we look at, which is attachment, which is looking at child development and how it's really important to have a good start in life and what happens to people when they don't have a good attachment with their parents or child carers. We also look at memory, how memories are stored, how they're retrieved and why we forget things. And there's some really interesting case studies of amnesiacs in that one as well. And the last topic we look at in the lower sixth year is social influence, which is things like obedience and conformity. And there's some really famous studies, which some of you will already know about. There's Milgram's obedience study, where he asked people to give electric shocks to somebody in another room and kept giving them orders to do this to see how far they would go. And then there's also another famous study, Zimbardo's study into, it was like a prison simulation, a role play, and to see how people respond to being in the role of a guard or a prisoner. Alongside all of these, there's various issues and debates. So we look at things like ethical issues, free will and determinism, nature, nurture, how scientific psychology is, whether it is a science or not. So there's various different issues and debates, and that some of that overlaps with RS and philosophy if students are interested in that area. And then finally, in the upper sixth year, we do have a choice. So there's 12 topics to choose from, and we have to do 3 of them. So the upper sixth that have just finished, they chose to do gender, eating behaviour and addiction. The lower sixth are voting at the moment. It looks like it might be relationships, stress, and possibly forensic or addiction. So we're going to have to find out soon. Usually people want to know how it is examined. So there's 3 papers, 3 2-hour papers at the end of 2 years. It's a range of questions. So some will be very short. There might be some multiple choice. There might be some interpreting graphs or looking at sort of scenario-based questions on how to explain behaviour. And the longest question in an exam would be 16 marks. So that's like a short essay. 25% of the examination is based on research methods and up to 10% is maths as well. And there's no coursework. Okay, so that's all I've got to say really. Is there any questions? Does anyone have anything they would like to ask? You can type in the chat box if you'd like to as well. No? I think that people in the past have said to me, please can you tell people that there's quite a lot of biology and quite a lot of maths. So those are probably the key things to be aware of. So the maths examples, someone's asked, how can you give some more maths examples? So we would do lots of exercises of collecting data. So it could be doing like a memory experiment and then seeing how many words someone has been able to recall under different circumstances. And then we need to do stuff with that data. So we put it into a graph and do things like averages and standard deviation. We might need to do a statistical test. So if, for example, we were looking at correlation, then we might carry out a Spearman's row on that data. But most of it is how to interpret the figure that you get rather than having to go through a long process of getting that figure. So we do a few examples in class, but in an exam situation, you might be given a figure and asked, what does that mean? So there is maths, but it's spread out throughout all the topics. So it could be a memory question with some maths in, or it could be an attachment question. It's sort of spread out through all the different topics. Okay. Anything else? Okay, so if any of the pupils want to come up and find me, I'm in room 42, and hopefully I think I met some of you last week. And any new students, if you want to email in and ask me any questions, you can get the email from the website or receptionist. Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
That's great. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.